crime data analyst Jeff Asher on how 2025 is shaping up to have the lowest murder rate in modern history. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious perspective that focuses on hard news and analysis instead of opinion and bloviating. I don't know if bloviating works as the word for that intro or not, but you guys can tell me in the comments. Keep trying to find a good second, what is it, not synonym, antonym for analysis and hard news. Anyway, this week, we are going to look at the crime data we've got so far here in 2025, which I think holds some really surprising information for us. And to do that, we have Jeff Asher, who is the co-founder of Datalytics, with us back on the show. Thank you once again for coming here to talk to us, Jeff. Appreciate you showing up.
Thank you very much. I should note, totally off the point of the conversation, I was in Philly this week for doing a presentation at a panel, and all of my questions are usually, I do a quiz about how bad crime data is. And the first question is always, who won the most recent Super Bowl? I didn't realize I was in Philly until they all started cheering. So I thought of you just a few moments ago thinking about that.
And hopefully if you go back next year, you get the same answer. We'll see.
Yeah.
But yeah. And so tell people a little bit about yourself and Datalytics for anyone who doesn't know already.
I'm a crime data analyst and consultant. We do data consulting, usually helping organizations, be it police departments, cities, states, advocacy groups, nonprofits, whoever needs data help. We tend to work in the criminal justice space, which ranges, again, police department, prosecutors, sort of official offices, to helping advocacy groups understand how to advocate better with the data that's available. And so it's a lot of different projects, and which makes it fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you also have a Substack where you publish different crime data reports for the public to look at occasionally as well. And one of your most recent ones from April is called "Crime is Likely Down an Enormous Amount So Far in 2025." And then you were also posting on social media recently that you actually think, and that is the big takeaway here, right? We'll start off with the big headline. We might actually reach a historic low in the crime rate this year. Is that right?
Yeah. So the piece I wrote last week, or I guess this Monday, was about how if you sort of do the early math, we would potentially have the lowest murder rate ever recorded. And we have data back to 1960. So we're not talking, however old, 250 years the country is.
Right.
I don't remember.
There's some limits to data collection, but 1960, that's a long time.
Right. It's a long time. It's all the official data that we have amongst the lowest murder rates ever recorded. The violent crime rate has tended to be about near the historic low. The last few years, it may or may not have set a new low last year. It's down a fair amount so far this year. And then the property crime rate has been at or near historic lows. Again, going back to the 1960s, maybe not the lowest ever recorded for violent crime or property crime, but the lowest recorded in the last 60 years, which is kind of where we're at now. I think the caveats is, I was talking about how terrible FBI data is. They won't release their 2024 figures until September, October of this year. So we won't actually know where we landed last year. And it's hard to do calculations about this year if you don't know what you're like, okay, we're down 12%. 12% from what? If you don't know what that what is, we can guess. We have a pretty good understanding, and our sourcing has improved a lot. But we don't know exactly how many murders there were in the U.S. last year. And they also the FBI revises the previous year numbers. So when they release the 2024 data, they'll revise usually up by a couple of hundred the 2023 numbers. So it gets to be a complicated calculation from not knowing where your percentage is right now. And then on top of that, it's May right now. We have data,
It's very
project we run, the Real-Time Crime Index has data through February right now. We're about to add in the next couple of days the March data. Other sources, the Gun Violence Archive, the Major City Chiefs has data through March. I went through and grabbed data just from the 30 most murderous cities in 2023 just to see if does that hold up? And all of them had data at least through March, most through April or early May. Again, you're talking about 20-something% decline in murder in that sample. So and
that's going to be most of the murders in the country on a raw number scale, right?
Yeah. So our real-time crime index has 400 cities of data, 402, I think, in the most recent sample, 99 million people. That's 50% of the murders from that 400 cities, 400 agencies. The other 17,600 agencies in the country are the other 50%.
Right.
So in general, a sample of that size, you're going to be off by 1 or 2 percentage points from the national change at the end of the year. So
you're pretty confident though in these early numbers.
I'm very confident
even though they're
in
not
these numbers. There's two things that I think you have to be concerned of when I say that it's May. One is that, if your team's up 28-7 in the second quarter, that's great. You got a 99% chance of winning that game. Teams in this situation tend to win these games,
right?
But you might not. There's always the Falcons blew a 28-3 lead in the Super Bowl. That happens every once in a while. And as a Saints fan, I enjoy reminding myself of that.
I was going to say it's quite the stray at the Falcons. But yeah, it makes sense, right?
It's my go-to. The other thing to be careful about is that when we get the data, especially when we get it from states, agencies still have another 11 months to correct underreporting. Mm. And so if an agency says there were 58 thefts in March 2025, they may revise that. Oh, there were actually 61 thefts. And so that doesn't have a huge difference, but especially early in the year when your numerator and your denominator is so much smaller than it'll be later in the year, 3 extra thefts is a bigger deal than later in the year when you've got, 3 divided by 60,000 versus 3 divided by, 10,000. So early in the year, we are overstating the decline, but I don't think we're overstating it by that much.
Right. So, and all of these things, right? And you're by nature not a very sensationalist guy from my experience reading your work and talking with you. So when you go out and say, look, this is early data, but what it indicates is that we're on a trajectory to have the lowest murder rate in maybe recorded history. That's not, you just trying to gin up some publicity for yourself, right? This is you understand these caveats, and even with them, you still feel that way, right?
Yeah. And I think that the weasel wording is incredibly important. And if I was just ginning up publicity, I wouldn't be using the weasel wording.
Which we appreciate here. That's what we're trying to get at. A sober, serious
CYA. Approach, right? It absolutely, again, it's a difficult calculation, but we can kind of say, okay, we know we have the 2023 number. And we know that murder was down about, I think, what was it? It was 5.5 per 100,000 in 2023. The data that we have puts murder down about 14%. So you do that math and you get about 4.9 to 5 per 100,000 is your murder rate probably last year. So that's roughly equivalent to where it was in 2019, which is basically what the data shows. And then if we're down, right now we have murder down 21%. Let's be extremely conservative and switch that to 10%. Then you're talking about a 10% decline from 5 is 4.5-ish per per 100,000. And the lowest ever recorded was like 4.46 or 4.45 in 2014. So, even if you're at your most conservative, you're sort of reaching where the lows were. And so that's kind of where, if you're sort of middle of the road, then you're blowing well past it, where the historic lows are. And so that's where we're at right now. Will it hold up? I hope so. There's no evidence that it won't, it'll completely disintegrate, but we also have another 6+ months to find that evidence.
So you're saying right now we're seeing something like a 20% decline in the murder rate. And we know that that's likely not going to be that large at the end of the year, just for the reasons that you outlined earlier. But even if you cut that decline in half, the percentage in half, you're still getting to a historic low.
Yeah, you're still about there. And you look at the individual cities, Philly has the fewest murders since 1965 or 1966. New York City had the second fewest murders that they've ever recorded. New Orleans.
And is that in raw numbers or is that in
raw numbers? Yeah. And,
really?
And for New York, the previous low was 2019, I think. So the rate doesn't change that much. New Orleans, even in spite of the Bourbon Street tragedy on January 1st, has had the second fewest murders recorded since 1970 something or 60 something.
Wow.
Baltimore has had a 10-year low. Detroit is fewest since the 1965, I think. Columbus, Ohio is at the fewest since the 1960s. So there's a number of cities where you're seeing very, very low counts of murders occurring. And so we can sort of guesstimate that, what we're seeing is not a data issue. It's not a reporting issue. It's a real trend.
Right. And I guess how predictable is the murder rate over a year, right? Because obviously there'll be fluctuations, right? Presumably, I believe more crime, the understanding most people have is that crime goes up in the summer, right? And declines, in the colder months. When you factor in looking at how the year progresses in regards to crime and murder, how can you predict, I guess, from this early drop off that it's going to continue to stay low, I guess, what is that? I guess give us some insight into here, how we can know just from this first quarter plus that the next 3 quarters are going to match that level, or why should we think that's a likely thing to happen?
So the thing to remember is that we had summer last year as well. So
right.
We're not talking about it's going to go up this summer and that's compared to last summer when it didn't go up. No, crime is more prevalent in the summer because it's warmer. Or I think a better way to think about it is it's colder in the winter, so people stay indoors, so there's less crime. It's not so much a summer thing, it's a winter thing. Where I'm in New Orleans, they don't care.
Yeah, warmer climates don't have that effect? Or?
No, they don't have that effect at all.
Interesting.
And so it's not something that we necessarily have to worry about the fact that summer is coming and that means an increase in crime. That's going to happen. Right. The question is the increase going to be worse than last year? And we certainly don't see any evidence of that yet in the data. I think that
obviously you don't have a crystal ball. You can't know what the crime rate's going to be from here to the end of the year. But if you look back historically, I guess there must be some
a sample of this size. And again, we only have data through February. When we're talking about in July or June, when we release our May data, then we're talking about pretty good predictive it usually ends within a couple of percentage points of where that sample year to date is.
So you don't see wild fluctuations after a certain point. You're just not, the vast majority of the time, you don't see wild fluctuations in the crime rate.
Right. And you could have a 2020 thing happen,
right,
where if you've gotten the data through March, you would have seen, murder's up a little bit. And then it was up 30%. Right. So it's certainly plausible that what we see is a change. I think whenever you see something historic, your inclination should be, that's wonderful. If it's a good historic thing, that's wonderful. We'll probably see it revert back to like non-historic. That said, usually a sample this size, early summer is usually pretty predictive of the end of the year. When you're talking about, I have an individual city, my city where I live, data through June. No, that's not predictive of the year. You may be down 8-10%, especially when you're talking about something like murders, where a 10% decline in murder might be 2 fewer murders than the year before, or something like that. So generally in a city, you want to wait until kind of those months that end in R before kind of guesstimating what your annual year to date will be. But when you have a large sample of cities and you see what we see now, which is basically that they're all kind of rowing in the same direction, that is strongly suggestive of the trend. Like we're onto the trend. And I would expect it to slow down, but it's so far down that it may not matter for setting a record. Okay,
I see. So, bottom line is most years crime follows a fairly predictable, I guess schedule's not the right word here, but it's fairly predictable pattern to how the crime, how the murder rate flows over the year. And you can start to get an idea of what the end of the year might be, barring some sort of major event, perhaps like what we saw with 2020 with the pandemic and the George Floyd's murder and the riots that followed that. And, all the chaos and upheaval that you probably wouldn't have necessarily been able to predict in, early March, late February, that was going to happen. Right.
No. And the other example that I would use is in the summer of 2022, somebody posted a video on TikTok of how to steal certain models of Kias and Hyundais. And you just saw overnight an explosion in auto thefts in big cities. And that's rare. And
right.
So
you wouldn't have been able to predict that was going to happen.
Right. And yes, auto theft was up. It went up a lot more almost overnight. Usually these things, they change very slowly. And so you think about, all right, we had a change in administration, very different rhetoric, very different approach to criminal justice and crime. But given that the federal government tends to not have a huge impact necessarily on like day-to-day crime, and the fact that these things, they turn around, they're like the Titanic, they're a cruise ship, they don't turn around overnight. So if, we have no idea what the new administration's policies will do to crime and criminal justice in America. And it's not surprising if we see another year and a half of whatever the trends were continuing before any impact that we might see occurs.
Yeah. And I do want to get into maybe some discussion of why we're seeing this happen. But first, let's just talk about just the truly remarkable nature of this, because if you go back to 2020, right, that we saw a historic rise in crime, and especially in the murder rate, right? You said, I think it was 30% that you mentioned earlier. And rates went from those historic lows. You mentioned 2019 was a pretty good year for the murder rate. 2014 was the all-time low, as you mentioned earlier, to this huge spike that brought us back to like the 90s level of murder rate, which as much nostalgia as people certainly my age have for the 90s, the murder rate was quite bad back then comparatively. And then now, 5 years in, we're not just reverting back to perhaps where we were, but going below the levels of murder that we saw and perhaps other crimes as well during that pre-pandemic era. Yeah. That's pretty remarkable, right?
It's absolutely remarkable. And I think we can keep our nostalgia for the late 90s when we sort of were seeing large declines in murder. But we didn't quite reach the early and mid 90s rates in 2020, 2021, 2022, but we were very close in terms of raw numbers of murders. And we probably had more firearm murders over those years than we had in the 90s, because the nature of murder has changed to where it's so much more firearm driven than any other weapon. And so, I would challenge anybody to find a piece written in 2020 or 2021 or 2022 saying, hey, we're going to see a dramatic decline and we're going to, within 2 or 3 years, we're going to be exceeding the pre-COVID levels and, be sort of threatening a new record low. I don't think that any of this was preordained. And I think anybody saying, well, it's just reversion to the mean, why did it occur when it occurred? Why is it dropping so sharply? This isn't just mean reversion. This isn't just we turned off the pandemic machine and everything went down. Because I think that simplifies the factors that are probably driving it. And I think that it suggests that this was something that doesn't really have a driver. It was just sort of this, of course it was going to go up. Of course it was going to go down. And I don't think the increase and I don't think the decrease was necessarily preordained.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone in 2020 was going to think in 2025 that we'd be where we are now. Certainly, you'd have to have a pretty optimistic worldview for that to have come to that conclusion. But I mean, let's get into maybe some of the most interesting bits that you've seen in this early data. Like you mentioned Philadelphia, for instance, being at an incredible low number of murders historically there. Are there other cities that stand out to you for good or bad?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Orleans stands out. I think last year Boston had the fewest murders since 1957. Boston's sort of its own thing. A bunch of places. So there's a organization in New York State called GIVE, the Gun Involved Violence Elimination Agency. It's a state agency. And so they've been measuring data since 2006 from originally 20 agencies that were basically the biggest police departments in the state that weren't New York City. And shootings have continually set new lows throughout the entire state. And all of those agencies, Buffalo and Syracuse and Albany and all of these places that are seeing really dramatic declines in gun violence that, is wonderful to see. Chicago's seen declines again. New York has seen declines again. Los Angeles has had the fewest murders since the 60s. That's another city. I guess I'm showing my non-West Coast bias and having forgotten Los Angeles, but there should be tons of headlines. I don't know why every reporter isn't flocking to Los Angeles, which is reporting record lows.
I mean, that is remarkable given that how much Los Angeles has expanded in population since the 1960s. Yeah,
it is. And San Francisco is seeing big declines in really across the board crime. San Francisco is not a huge murder city, but it is a large property crime city. And they've seen dramatic declines in property crime. And you talked about what a hellhole San Francisco is. I don't know if I can say that without getting bleeped on the podcast, but there was lots of talks about how San Francisco was falling apart and the city was irredeemable and just trash and issues everywhere. And now they're seeing dramatic declines in crime and increases in quality of life. And so none of this was preordained. We're seeing very positive trends. I get yelled at when I say things are going up. And, everybody switches sides and I get yelled at when things are going down. And so, but we've definitely, I'm just trying to call balls and strikes here and we're definitely seeing
that's what we're interested
downward trends.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of, to be honest though, that sounds like there maybe isn't, it sounds like a lot of cities are having record lows and it's not really like Philadelphia did something special or LA did something very special.
Well, and that's the real challenge. And every news article about you see is they'll interview the chief or somebody with the city, and the city will point to whatever program they did as the cause. And it doesn't matter if the program was implemented, 15 months after the decline started in the city. It has to be, here's what we did, so that must be the decline. And it's the challenge of explaining this is that you have to explain it based on the fact that one, police departments didn't grow. Police departments shrank a ton from especially big city police departments shrank a ton between 2019 and 2022. They shrank again in 2023. In 2024, they were down like 0.1%. So basically even. Police departments are not growing. So it's not like in the 90s when you could say, oh, we hired a ton of cops. We're not doing that right now. And two, it's national in scope. It's everywhere. And so your explanation you can't have hyper local explanations. We implemented this program, or we patrolled this neighborhood differently. And because the more satisfying explanations are going to be more national in scope and account for the fact that we're not seeing just like floods of police officers that are bringing a policing solution to this problem.
Are there any exceptions that you've seen? It sounds like there's a lot of bright spots. Are there any cities or states or anything in the data that is going the opposite direction that you think is notable?
Now I have to rack my brain because yes, there's always exceptions. We're definitely seeing that in Houston and Fort Worth. We're seeing declines or seeing increases, excuse me. Whenever you have let's say 80% of cities are going in one direction, that means 20% of cities are going in the other direction. And it just like there are outliers because there are outliers. And because this is something that there's a lot that goes into, when a bullet leaves a gun, whether or not somebody is killed, and you're talking about low base rate stats anyway. So, with a couple of dozen non-fatal shootings turning into murders, and you're talking about, we had a dramatic decline versus a dramatic increase. So there are outliers. There aren't very many of them. I think Fort Worth is the biggest. They had 21 murders through March compared to 9 last year. So that's a reasonably large outlier, but it's also a small number of crimes.
Right. So you're not seeing anything in the outliers that makes you that would suggest some policy solution, or there's something they did that's making them see an increase while everybody else is seeing a decrease. It's kind of more just a result of statistical noise, I guess you could say. Yeah,
more or less. The places that last year you might have talked about as the outliers going up, like Memphis and Baton Rouge. Those are places where we are currently seeing declines. So, not Memphis, Charlotte and Baton Rouge. So sometimes they're just outliers, and I don't think it's easy to explain why or what they're doing wrong.
And that's what you'd expect. You see that every year, basically.
Yeah. I think about, you saw murder start to decline in like 1992, 1993 nationally. And by 1994, it was going down at a decent enough clip from sort of those historic highs that the country had hit in the early 90s, the worst part of the country had ever had in terms of gun violence and murder. New Orleans, where I am in 1994, had 430 murders. So the highest murder rate any city had recorded ever up to that point was in New Orleans in 1994, while murder was going down nationally. And then in 1995, things started to get better in New Orleans. So generally, we expect every city to kind of follow the national trend, but they all kind of do it at their own pace. And sometimes they do it more, sometimes they do it less. It's not necessarily set in stone.
That's fascinating. It is really fascinating just to think about how, murders in New Orleans and murders in Los Angeles or New York could all be, you can track them all in similar long-term trends, right? Given that they're, so different geographically, and I'm sure by their makeup of people and income and all of that, it's pretty fascinating that they still follow these national trends.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pulling up the Los Angeles numbers. At this point last year, they had 113 murders. This year they have 83.
Wow.
So you're seeing, decently large declines.
And massive decline from that all-time high, right?
Yeah. And they don't have more historical numbers than that, but that's obviously very, very encouraging. New York had 99 so far this year compared to 135 last year. Down, and you talk about that historic, down 85.5% year to date relative to where they were 32 years ago. Wow. So I guess 1993 they're comparing to as well, which is probably kind of the New York heyday. And we could go on for pretty much every major city that we're seeing. I think of the 30 most murderous cities, when I ran the numbers a couple weeks ago, 25 of them were seeing declines.
Wow.
Yeah. Which is remarkable. Good news. And it's very good news. When in 2020, the worst year we'd ever had, it was like 70-30 or 75-25 going up. So there were still cities that saw declines. Right. Now that we're seeing an even larger share going down is remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, wow. And it's fascinating for it to be such a clearly national trend too, given, like you mentioned earlier, that like the federal government isn't responsible for most of your regular policing. So, and there's 50 different policies. Now I'm sure they're all influenced by one another, and the federal government has some influence over how states and localities police, but it's not like it's all centrally controlled in a way that would make you think a national correlation between cities on different sides of the country and different oceans would be an obvious outcome. So that, it's pretty remarkable. And, one of the things you mentioned, I will say there's with policing, right? One, you mentioned that we haven't seen a huge national increase in the number of police on the streets or anything like that, or police funding necessarily. But we have seen a difference in how police operate from the pandemic to today, right? Even if that is more perhaps of a reversion to how they had operated before the pandemic. The pandemic obviously did disrupt a lot of things with policing, both the virus itself and the shutdowns that occurred, keeping police, off the streets as much as they had been before that, perhaps. And then, police relations were pretty rough during the pandemic and the George Floyd protests as well. So some people think there was a sort of a pullback in policing of the cops that were on the streets were less likely to, interact. I don't know. Does some of that maybe play a role in what's going on?
It certainly could. I think it's something that's hard to measure. Yeah. I think the bigger challenge is that, especially in big cities, the median agency has fewer officers, like far fewer officers now than they did 5-6 years ago. In 2024, the FBI just came out with its 2024 law enforcement employees data. The median agency for a city of 250,000 or more had 865 officers. And in 2019, they had 865 officers. And in 2024, they had 820 officers or 817 officers. So basically, you're talking about agencies having to do more with less. And so you've seen in a lot of places increasing response times. You've seen lesser clearance rates. Some of that is just because crime went up, but some of that I'm sure is because you have fewer detectives. And so that's been a really a major issue for a lot of those agencies. Even if they want to change how they police, they don't have the staffing necessarily to make major changes.
So it's obviously not all policing, though policing, I'm sure, has an effect. I mean, there's a lot of things culturally, I guess, that could also contribute to it. But it's perhaps harder to nail down with data. For instance, one theory, and there's a professor at University of Chicago who wrote a fascinating piece on, he had 4 different factors. One of them was this policing idea that has gotten a lot of discussion over the last couple of years, obviously. But then there's also just the idea of people coming back into public spaces in the way that they weren't during the murder spike, during the pandemic. The public spaces were either literally closed for a while or just much less foot traffic than they had previously had. And so people just coming back into normal public spaces like that might have an effect on crime. Just so is like people going back to work, a lot fewer people just being idly around their neighborhoods at home. There's less potential for interpersonal conflict. And because of that, some of these things would seem to make a logical sense, but I don't know if they're something you can quantify in the data.
No,
similarly,
it's certainly very difficult to quantify in the data. Yeah. I think just sort of generally the decline in the stresses from the pandemic, that the things that were driving us all nuts for years sort of gradually went away. I think that as a contributing factor certainly makes sense. I think when I think about what would drive these national changes, it's much more what I would sort of term as investment in communities. And that's where you can potentially look at the federal government as a major driver of the decline. John Roman, we were talking about earlier before we started.
That's the professor I was talking about.
Yeah. John has talked about how just like state and local government hiring, flunked in the pandemic and then surged after it. And so those are people that are helping people in need, people that are providing services to the community.
So it's like a root causes argument, right, for crime?
Yeah, to a degree. I think it's more just like community investment. And then you look at things like construction. So state and local government construction on highways was up 20%. On public safety, policing and public safety was up almost 50%. On neighborhood and social centers was up almost 90% from 2019 to 2024. So you had all of this funding, all of these investments coming into communities. And then you had a big increase in DOJ grants they basically fell off a cliff. It was like from $4.5 billion in 2019 to $2 or so billion in 2021. And then 2023, you hit over $5 billion. So really huge increase in money going to communities, helping to spur employment, spur philanthropy, spur citywide programs, statewide programming, spur construction projects. Things get nicer. You tend not to destroy them as easily. And then lots of federal investments specifically in policing, in analysis, in victim support, things like that from DOJ. And so I think that when you put all of this together, it's not so much that one of these things was the factor. It's just that there was a lot more investment in American communities for 2022, 2023, 2024. And so it took a little bit for you to kind of hit that top and then start to come down. And now we're seeing a dramatic decline, and who knows where the bottom will be.
And, obviously I think a lot of people in my audience would also point to increase in gun ownership that happened during that time. People argue that there's a deterrent effect on that, whether literal, actual self-defense incidents or just, criminals being less emboldened because they fear person they're victimizing may be armed, those sorts of effects. But there are surveys that ask people if they've, used a firearm in self-defense, like the English survey that came out, I think, 2021. But I don't know if we've seen anything, if there's any more concrete data that would provide insight into that or not that you've picked up on.
I don't know if it's collected, and I don't know the degree to which those types of surveys are necessarily accurate, and the degrees to which they accurately reflect, like, crime patterns are really big. And so I don't think that more firearms with more defensive uses would explain, we would probably see a big increase in manslaughter and in fatal shootings. And we're not necessarily seeing that. And we're not seeing an increase in non-fatal shootings. People are using firearms less often now than they were before.
Right.
Whether it's for
most
self-defense.
of the self-defense incidents in that English survey are where nobody actually fires a shot, right?
Yeah.
They're used as deterrent in warning someone off. But I don't know that, his survey, And the other surveys that came before it, like CLEX in the 90s, they didn't really try to track usage over time. They're just trying to give a sort of baseline number for how many defensive gun uses they believe occur.
I think it's very difficult to measure.
Yeah,
and I think
we've had podcasts in the past that look at the specifics, arguments for and against, including with Professor English himself, but also with some of his critics, like the head of the Gun Violence Archive criticizes that form of measuring defensive gun uses. He has his own form, which uses media reports instead. But and the numbers you get are obviously, depending on how you look at it, are going to be wildly different. But I don't know. I was just wondering if there was anything that you've seen in crime data that we can attribute to that sort of deterrent effect of defensive gun use, or even the instances of them, because the FBI doesn't track stuff like that, right?
No, and I don't know how we would track it from. It's already bad enough, the data. I don't know how
it is difficult to track, because if you don't fire your gun in a defensive gun use, you're probably not going to file a police report.
Right.
Even if you did, it probably wouldn't show up in the kind of crime data that you're collecting, right?
And how do you measure something that didn't happen? If if you are showing a firearm,
there's a lot to,
and a crime didn't occur,
right?
Because you showed your firearm, then you can't measure a crime that didn't occur.
Exactly. So there's certainly complications with trying to get a data focused approach on what that effect, just like some of these other effects you're describing, right? Like, you can look at community investment increasing, and then, the crime rate or the murder rate goes down. And it's just like some people would look at firearm purchases, background checks for firearm purchases going up, and then the murder rate goes down. People will argue that those are connected. But obviously that's not, that's a more spurious argument, right? Like, it could be that, but correlation doesn't automatically mean causation, right? That's sort of a basic principle.
Right. Yeah.
So it's hard to know, I guess, is the bottom line with some of these things.
Virtually impossible, I would argue.
Yeah. But these are the best theories that we've got out there, right? As to why this is happening.
Yes. And I like to point out that, we've got some good ideas, some strongly tested ideas about why crime fell in the 90s, but we don't know why crime fell in the 90s. Like, there's no prevailing commentary that says this is why. And usually it's, when I say that, if I get in trouble, it's, so-and-so did a study about lead and other thing. And they'd be like, well, yeah.
Lead and gasoline. Yeah.
Maybe they're like, maybe that's a contributing factor, but you don't know that. So.
Yeah, it's complex, right? I mean, presumably there's a lot of variables that have an impact on crime.
Yeah.
So it's hard to boil it down into
there
one
should be,
thing.
right? It's complicated. And that's why it gets frustrating when people are like, oh, well, it's X.
Yeah.
It's probably not just X.
Right. Just a tidbit at the end here, and I don't want to fall into another flaw of just extrapolating from one data point here, but usually people have the impression that their impression of what the crime rate is doing is almost like the opposite of what's actually happening. Most people think, or maybe honestly, I think it seems like most people just think crime is getting worse all the time, even when it was at historic lows in like 2014, 2019. People still thought that crime was getting worse. And I wonder if that's holding now, because and this is, again, just based on one data point from the most recent YouGov poll, and it is sort of filtered through another prism here, because it's about President Trump's approval ratings, and they asked about like 52 different issues, and his best issue is crime. He was +9 on crime. So whereas he was underwater on, I think, 47 of the issues, 47 of the 52 that they asked about, meaning that he had a lower approval rating than disapproval rating on everything but a couple of issues, the best being crime. So do you think people are noticing that the crime rate is just nosediving like this?
I don't know. You look at Gallup's annual poll of whether or not people say there's more crime in the U.S. this year rather than last year. And there's been 2 years since 1990 when they started asking the question, I think it was 2000 and 2001, where people said, no, there's less crime than there was a year ago. By like more than 50% of people said that. So it's something where people tend to either think crime is up or the data is wrong. And that's an unfortunate situation. It's part of what drives me to do what I do and hopefully communicate better and reach more people and start to explain what the trends are. And we maybe saw that a little bit last year in the Gallup poll, where 29% of Democrats, 68% of independents, and 90% of Republicans said crime was falling in 2024, which it absolutely did. And so it's not good.
There's a large partisan.
The large partisan gap is there's always been a partisan gap, but it's never been this big. That's not good. But like reached at least one political party. I think that's good, and work on reaching the other one.
Well, I guess that's an area where we'll definitely have to wait for more polling evidence. So, and like I said, it is filtered through the prism of Donald Trump. And so you're just likely to get more Republicans saying he's doing good on whatever issue than you are Democrats, just by the nature of where our politics are at right now. Just like the same thing happened with Joe Biden, of course, and has been happening for quite a while in polling. But I don't know. Maybe that's a sign. Maybe people are starting to catch on that actually the crime rate is nosediving, and that's a very good thing. Which is, a lot of news doesn't focus on good stories, right? That's a common complaint we a lot of consumers have. But of course, the if it bleeds, it leads is that's a cliche for a reason. People pay more attention to bad news most of the time.
Absolutely.
But I think for our show, it's important to understand what's actually happening and to get like a clear but nuanced picture of it. And that's why we have guys like you come on and can give us all the ins and outs and give us the caveats that go along with it. And I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So if people want to follow more of your writing and, get a better understanding of this issue, where can they do that?
Datalytics newsletter, jasher.substack.com, I think is the Substack. So come out once a week, and it's always a good time.
Yes, it's jasher.substack.com. And I'm a subscriber, of course, and also follow you on social media as well, where you post fairly regularly. And so I appreciate you coming on to give us these updates whenever they occur. And I was really surprised to hear, I was in that camp of like, all right, we're just, maybe mean reversion. The pandemic was a blip. We're going back to where we were. It kind of seems like maybe it's something more than that. So
yeah, it might be. We'll find out.
Hopefully we continue in this good direction that we've been in. But we'll have to have you back on in the future.
Let's talk again in 6 months.
Yeah, to see how these trends actually turn out and whether we get another black swan event. Hopefully we won't, or maybe a good black swan event. Who knows?
Yeah.
But that's all we've got for this week. We will see you guys again real soon.